Hi, everyone. This is Adam Weiser from the Illinois Self-Advocacy Alliance. We call ourselves Alliance for short. I am the project director for the Alliance. During our presentation, all attendees will be in listen-only mode. If you want to connect with the presenter or the Alliance, please use the chat box. You can also raise your hand if you want to speak. We'll have time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. This presentation is being recorded and will be placed on the Alliance's YouTube channel. Be sure to check out our YouTube channel. We have more than 140 recorded presentations that are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days of the year. March is Developmental Disabilities Awareness Month. During this month, we want to raise awareness about the inclusion of people with developmental disabilities in all facets of community life, as well as awareness of the barriers that people with disabilities still sometimes face in connecting to the communities in which they live. The theme for this year's Developmental Disabilities Awareness Month is a world of opportunities. We are celebrating people and working together to remove obstacles. Our goal is to build a community that's committed to creating a world where everyone can do well and succeed. Join us in making a world where all kinds of people have the chance to thrive. To help us raise awareness, today's presentation is an introduction to developmental disabilities, including the definition of developmental disabilities, types of the developmental disabilities, and resources for self-advocates and families. Our presenter is Jae Jin Pak. Jae Jin's pronouns are he, him. He is a self-advocate, educator, and ally with over 30 years of experience working on issues such as disability advocacy, mental health, gender-based violence, crisis intervention, culture competency, and leadership development. Let's welcome Jae Jin Pak.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. Thank you, Adam, for the kind introduction. And cross fingers so I share my slide and Zoom cooperates. Let's see here. Make sure I'm picking the right one. There we go. Alrighty. So again, thank you everybody for inviting me. I appreciate the Alliance for inviting me to be present today on the introducing developmental disabilities. So today is the plan for today is just going to give after introductions, talk about the definition of what developmental disability is, and what some of the criteria are. Also, how it's connected to intellectual disabilities. Along the way, talk about some of the differences, and then finish up with resources and any questions that you all have. So, as Adam said, my name is Jae Jin Pak, and I work at the University of Illinois Chicago's Institute on Disability and Human Development. I also am the Self-Advocacy training mentor for the Illinois LEND program and a co-founder of Chicagoland Disabled People of Color Coalition, and also a long fan of the Alliance as well. So, and I also like to say, I also identify as having a couple of disabilities myself. I grew up with low vision and epilepsy and seizures, which epilepsy I also learned is part of the developmental disability community under that umbrella. So let's see. So before we talk about definitions and criteria I think I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about definitions and language. And I say this is important because, one of the things that I think that we've all experienced as disabled folks, and I'll say for myself personally, um, growing up, being diagnosed with low vision and diagnosed with epilepsy and seizures, there's a lot of medical jargon, and there's also a lot of stereotypes and stigma. And I think it wasn't until and when I was an adult that I understood the that the importance of context, um, criteria, define a definition of what epilepsy is and what it's used for is very different from letting that affect how I felt about myself, as well as defining disability and all the negative stigma around disability. It's like, yes, that negative stigma and stereotypes are out there, but it doesn't have to define, or I don't have to let it define my life or my limitations. So and I say that because the other thing about that when we talk about language and definitions is that as time moves on, definitions sometimes change. For example, the definition of family. Long time ago, there was definitions of family just seen as mom, dad, and children and related by blood. Now, as time has evolved and we have grown as people and grown our understanding of what family means, the definition of family now encompasses, yes, moms and dads with children, but it could also be two moms with kids, two dads with kids, interracial couples, step families. It families can be people that don't know each other but have grown a strong bond. So I use that as an example of how definitions can change. And I say that, and I want to start with that so that as we talk about the definition of developmental disabilities and some of the criteria to help keep it in its perspective of its useful information in certain in different ways of how we receive services, how we maybe are categorized through government systems, state systems, different disability provider systems, like what's on the screen of how different systems or organizations use definitions as a way of helping to develop eligibility criteria, um, or develop other categories of how to organize things or organize services and deliveries and things like that, whether that's government systems, education systems, so all of and healthcare systems. So again, the criteria and the definitions, I think it's important for us to keep in mind that they have a use, but outside of those uses of eligibility, of categorizing, maybe diagnosis and medical context, outside of that, try not to let that interfere or shape how we view ourselves as best as we can. Okay. So, as we talk about disability, I want to start by showing this video that I found. I think also it kind of does a nice job of introducing intellectual and developmental disabilities. So let's listen to this.
IDD is short for Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, which is a broad term that combines both types of disabilities. Although there is a good deal of overlap between these categories, there are some distinct differences as well. A disability is anything that seriously limits a person's ability to function in their daily life. Within the category of disability, there is developmental disability, or DD, and intellectual disability, or ID. A developmental disability is a serious and chronic condition due to the way it impacts someone mentally and/or physically. It shows up before the age of 22 and remains present the person's whole life. Many different disabilities fall into this category, with some well-known examples being autism, fetal alcohol syndrome, cerebral palsy, and spinal bifida. It can impact a person in several ways and limit their ability to care for themselves, communicate, learn, move, and provide for themselves financially. With ongoing support that is tailored to individual needs, people with developmental disabilities can thrive. Services and accommodations should reflect the person's unique needs and be individually planned and coordinated. These services and accommodations often need to be offered to the person throughout their entire life or for an extended duration. Unlike developmental disabilities, which encompass a range of different disabilities, intellectual disability is a specific diagnosis. However, there is a wide range of causes that make each case unique, including genetics, emotional trauma, and brain injury. Most, but not all, variations of intellectual disability fall under the umbrella of developmental disabilities. Intellectual disabilities begin during childhood and cause impairments or difficulties in how people think, act, manage their emotions, and engage socially with others. Although lower IQ may be one indicator, intellectual disability is not diagnosed using IQ score, but rather professional assessments of reasoning abilities, interpersonal skills, and practical skills like personal hygiene and money management. People living with intellectual disability may have trouble in school or maintaining employment, making new friends, managing their time, planning ahead, completing tasks, and taking care of themselves. Initial diagnosis of any kind of IDD must be done by a licensed and trained medical or behavioral health provider. Identification and diagnosis of IDD is key for individuals to access needed services, such as professional interventions, inclusive environments, and individualized support strategies. All of those services and strategies need to be relevant, appropriate, timely, consistent, person-centered, respectful, and evidence-based to be effective. Although some changes in access, knowledge, and equity for people with disabilities have occurred since the Americans with Disabilities Act passed, much work needs to be done to reduce the stigma of disability. Don't let stigma stop you or someone you know from getting support and services. Ask your healthcare provider about an assessment for intellectual or developmental disability and treatment options. Diagnosis is the first step towards a healthier and more rewarding life for those with IDD. If you're a mental health or behavioral health provider seeking information on evidence-based treatment, check out our multimedia solution for continuing education and shareable patient resources at psychhub.com.
Alrighty. So I found that video and I liked it because it does a nice job of introducing and giving a big broad overview of developmental disabilities, and we'll kind of go through some of the different parts of it as we move on. So, as was shared in the video, developmental disabilities is a broad category, and developmental disabilities are formed or have their onset during developmental years, which is primarily our childhood, from when we're born through infancy, young kids growing up into adolescence, and then growing up into adults. So from like birth to 22, 21, 22. In those developmental years, there are four components of child development that we'll talk about. Physical development, cognitive development, language development, and social emotional development. Developmental disabilities Developmental disability is a disability that one of these four one or more of these four components are impacted. And we'll talk a little bit more about each of those. So, for example, physical development refers to how our body develops, muscles, skeletons, strength, range of motion, um, those aspects of physical development as we grow. If there are, if we have a medical condition or disability that affects how our muscles develop so that we don't have full range of motion, or our skeletons develop in a way that, again, limits our mobility, then that could be considered a developmental disability um, if it happens during our developmental years. Cognitive development are refers and involves the areas around things like thinking and problem solving. So, how we learn things, how we process information, when we see a problem and kind of different types of problems or challenges, how we resolve them and move through them and figure them out. Again, if we have a disability that significantly interferes or limits how we process information or problem solves, or we need help to problem solve or to process information, then that would be considered a developmental disability. The third component of development is language development. How, from birth on up into throughout our childhood, we learn language. In the US, it could be English as well as Spanish and a multitude of other languages depending on our family. But, we learn language and how to communicate with each other. Um, and that builds vocabulary and helps us understand and communicate with others. If we have a disability, if someone has a disability, that their ability to learn language or their ability to use language, a certain type of language, is impaired or significantly limited, then that might be a developmental disability. Again, if it came across in their developmental years. And then the fourth component or area of development is social emotional development. How we manage our feelings and emotions, how we connect with other people and develop friendships, how we connect to our families and have the loving, caring bond, those interpersonal relationships. Again, if a person has a disability where, again, their ability to make those types of emotional connections is impaired or significantly different, then that could be a developmental disability. Okay. So again, these are the four main components that are associated with developmental disabilities. And it's all about if they have if one or more of those developmental components has a significant limitation or impairment. Having said that, just because a person's development is different under the definition of developmental disability doesn't mean there's anything wrong with them. Going back to our conversation of language and definitions, this is the categories or the language that we use to say if a person's language development, physical development is impaired or significantly limited, just means that their development is different in a significant way than quote unquote what is established to be kind of normal or mainstream or the majority. That's just to identify the difference. I think it's important to say we should not judge, and there should not be any judgment just because someone has a develops differently. They're still good, normal people. They just think differently, feel differently, process differently, communicate differently. And the category or the diagnosis of a developmental disability, all that means is that it helps them access resources and services to meet their needs. And it's a way of communicating to different providers and systems. These are the types of accommodations I need. We really should, again, not put any judgment on it. Um, again, developmental disabilities is very, very broad. There's all kinds of different type of disabilities that fall under the umbrella. And again, developmental disabilities can be disabilities that impact all four of the developmental components that we talked about, or any one or combination of any of the four. Okay. And the other, and again, as we mentioned earlier, because the one of the main reasons why it's developmental is because the onset and the diagnosis of disability of these developmental disabilities is under the age of 22 when we're, where all these components are developing. Okay. Oh, and I covered the different categories. And again, as a reminder, there's a lot of broad differences. For example, these are just some of the different types of disabilities that fall under developmental disabilities. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, cerebral palsy, Fragile X. Okay. Intellectual disability falls under developmental disabilities, like any kind of language disabilities or learning disabilities, and Tourette's. These are, and as you can see, it gives you a sense of how diverse developmental disabilities are. That encompasses both physical, like visible disabilities, like cerebral palsy, where someone's movement or they may need a walker or assistive technologies, as well as maybe some invisible disabilities, like someone with autism or a learning disability, where it may not be as obvious when you first meet somebody. So again, it just goes to, again, just kind of as a reminder how diverse and varied developmental disabilities are and can be. So, one of the, as mentioned, when we talk about developmental disabilities, one of the other disabilities that's associated with it is intellectual disabilities. And the definition of intellectual disabilities that the American Association of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities has shared is that IDD is a collection of that is a condition that is characterized by significant limitations to both intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior. And when the onset is again under the age of 22. So again, intellectual disabilities, to be considered intellectual disability, the onset or diagnosis is through our developmental years, and that it has to have a significant uh, impact on intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior. So what is intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior? Intellectual functioning refers to intelligence, how we learn, um, how we process information, our mental capacity. Um, and again, this language and the language around identifying what intelligence and intellectual functioning is to use to help categorize and define things. It's not a judgment on anyone's intelligence, maturity, or ability to learn. Um, and I think, again, I just keep wanting to keep reiterating that. So that's intelligence. And as was mentioned in the video, one of the ways that intelligence or intentional functioning is measured is through IQ tests, which on paper makes some sense, but in practice, there's some issues around in IQ tests in general. But it's a one way of kind of getting a ballpark or an estimate idea of measuring intelligence. Um, but again, as also was mentioned in the video, IQ tests are not the end all be all of identifying or diagnosing intellectual disabilities. For someone to be, you know, identified or diagnosed with an intellectual disability, it is important that they see trained doctors, psychologists, and professionals who are trained in that and go through all the different types of testing that's available to get that, and not just rely solely on IQ tests. Um, the other aspect of intellectual disabilities was mentioned was adaptive behavior. These are different types of behaviors and skills that we all use and exert throughout the day. It's how we the adaptive behaviors can be, ideas on how we manage time, how we manage money, how we understand the ideas around making money, spending money, saving money, how we spend time in a productive way. Um, Also, things like, uh, again, reading, writing, learning, using language, and social skills are underneath the umbrella of adaptive behaviors. Again, how we interact with people, how we interact and make friends, how we interact socially in a work and professional setting, and all the skills that are related to how we live our daily lives. If we need help, supports, services, adaptive equipment, accommodations, so that we can be as independent and live our lives to the fullest of our ability with supports, then because of an intellectual disability, that would be that would be an intellectual disability is um, when we need supports for that. Um, so again, it's a way of just kind of reminding the different criteria. Having said all that, again, I think it's I want to bring back to the idea of developmental disabilities, intellectual disabilities, to keep it And again, back in context of understanding what these are can help families and help us with disabilities advocate for ourselves. The definitions are very much used to provide around eligibility for different services, whether it's SSI, disability services, accommodations. When we ask for accommodations for school or for work, understanding the definition can help us when we ask for accommodations to say, I have a disability. This is my disability. This is what the accommodations are. And it's not just me saying it, it's, you know, doctors, psychologists, other professionals, the law that says this is what the criteria are. I fall under that, and I have a right to ask for accommodations. And it can be a source of helping us advocate for our rights. Um, you know, as we think about developmental developmental disabilities awareness month and the importance of understanding and raising awareness and acceptance and saying those of with developmental disabilities, we're part of society. I think it's important to remind people of the diversity that we have and that we're not limited to what the stereotypes are, or we're not limited to just what the diagnosis is, or even what the definition is. So use this information to help understand what developmental disabilities are, what intellectual disabilities are. That if this is something that you're part of the intellectual disability community or the developmental disability community, something the lesson that I learned from mentors and disabled leaders in my life was helping me realize definition doesn't have to be a burden, doesn't have to be a bad thing. It can be a tool to help with advocating for our rights. And part of that is, accessing other resources. So these are resources, national resources for different disabilities, some that I mentioned earlier, others that are different, that you can look for, that families can connect with and learn about. For resources for self-advocates, there's the Autism Self-Advocacy Network, self-advocates being empowered, of course, the Alliance, our Illinois Council on Developmental Disabilities, the ARC of Illinois. If there are folks who and families and individuals looking to get connected with resources to help, find out if a loved one may have a developmental disability or intellectual disability. One resource is within a UIC. UIC, in my department, we have a developmental disability clinic, family clinic, where we have, again, trained professionals, psychologists, psychiatrists, doctors, who are trained to do screenings and work with children and families to explore that possibility and the option of a developmental disability and all the resources and supports that go along with it, as well as the other organizations that are listed on this on the resource sheet as well. And I'll make this available. I'll send it to Adam and Christine, so if folks are interested, they can have access to the links that are on the resource list. Okay. And really, that's pretty much it. I also want to give credit to a colleague who helped put some resources together that I mentioned, I think, way back in the beginning, is our Illinois Len Fellow, um, Abukar El-Shir, uh, who is a colleague of mine who helped pull some of the information and resources together. So with that, kind of finishes my part. If you all have questions, I'm more than happy to have a conversation as well. I'm going to stop my share so I can see y'all.
Yes. Thank you so much, Jae Jin. I have been getting some questions. I have also gotten one comment. The comment is, thank you for saying that definitions change over time, that they are not always set in stone, and that definitions can change, or the way we interpret things can change over time. So somebody was very appreciative of that. Here's some other questions. And this is kind of a two-parter.
Mm-hmm.
Do we need to educate the community about people with intellectual and developmental disabilities? And if so, what is the best way to do it?
Ooh, that's a good question. Yes, I think that there is value and important to educate the community, the disability community, our family communities, our local communities, all the communities that we may be connected with. I think there's value in sharing and educating. Having said that, it is also important to give ourselves permission to say to ourselves, we don't have to educate everybody. So yes, there's value in education, but do as much for as little as you want. I do this for my work. Um, so I get paid for it. I care about it, and it's my work. I know other self-advocates who do different types of work who really, you know, aren't don't have the time or the interest in educating or talking about disability as much as I do. And that's fine. Everybody's different. Just because I think that's the other thing that I learned that I was grateful for from a disabled mentor is um, for in my early 20s, I think maybe going into my 30s, there was a part of me that thought, oh, I'm disabled. I should go into disability work because that's what I should do because I'm disabled. Um, and someone told me, no, it's like if you have other interests, you can do other things. Just because we're disabled and we care doesn't mean we all have to become disabled leaders or disabled experts. Um, if you want to be a writer, if you want to go into engineering, if you want to go into teaching, if you want to become a chef, whatever those are all fine. Those are all great opportunities, and there are disabled folks that do all those types of work too. And I think it's important to say yes, it's important to educate, but it's not. It doesn't have to be every disabled person's responsibility. If you want to, if you really feel the the desire and it's important to you, fantastic. If you don't care, that's cool too. We're all different.
All right. Thank you for that. Here is the next question. What is one thing that allies can do to support people with intellectual and developmental disabilities living their best lives?
Oh, I think allyship is incredibly important. I think allies can be you can be great allies by I think one some ways you can be allies is if you're with people with disabilities, encouraging them to um, speak up for, and make and communicate their wants and decisions to the people around them on on everyday occurrences, going to the store, going to a restaurant, interacting with other people on other day-to-day things. If people kind of are uncertain or look to you to answer questions, as I've had this happen when I've had my white cane and been with people who don't have a cane, say, well, what does he want? And allies that I appreciate will say, well, ask him, and redirect them to me. And allies can, redirecting the people to talk with the self-advocate, recognizing their ind individuality, their autonomy, treating um, adults with IDD or adults with disabilities as adults. Um, uh, I think, and even in Al, I think, uh, showing up to support policies or activities or events around disability, so that if there's a disability pride parade or disability events or talks, to be there as attendees to learn, um, listen when people with disabilities talk, listen, um, make the choice to be quiet and to take it in and to listen and to um, follow disabled leaders or self-advocates. Um, because I think one of the things that we, as people with disabilities, have gotten messages is you need to follow able-bodied folks, the the professionals, and we have we know what's best for us as disabled folks, and it's important for allies to listen. The best allies, from my experience, and the allies that I truly respect and value, are the allies that when I share opinions and ideas or ways that they can best help me, is they don't question, they don't argue, they take it in and they follow my lead and they prop me up. And those are the types of things and the type of attitudes that really are helpful for allyship.
Thank you so much for that. In the comments, we've had a couple folks saying thank you for this wonderful information and this presentation. I do have one final question, and this is a reminder to any of our participants. If you have any questions, comments, or considerations that you'd like us to share, go ahead and type them into the chat box. So this final question that I have received to ask is, what is one thing that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities can do to live their best lives? What's one piece of advice that you can give people with intellectual and developmental disabilities so that they can live their best lives?
Oh, that's a really good question, and it's a hard question. It may sound corny, but I would encourage people with IDD, to just decide, I want to live my life. My and 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 tell yourself, my life, my interest is valid, and I have a right to be happy. Um, and remind yourself of that. Your life matters too. Your wants, your goals matter, whatever they are. Um, and to just try to remind ourselves of that, and I say that as someone who is 55 years old with developmental with my epilepsy and my low vision, and I still, every once in a while, or as often as I can, remind myself that as a disabled person, I still deserve and have a right to pursue what I want to do and to be happy and to have a happy life. And to ask, I think also um, another way of pursuing a full life is also reminding ourselves that it's okay for us to ask for help. Um, that it's not because sometimes I think we get stuck in this idea that we want to be independent, and so we should do everything we can by ourselves. And yes, to some extent, do everything you can and be as independent as possible. But I find myself not trying sometimes reminding myself it's okay for me to ask for help when I need it. And I have bad days when I need more help than others, and that's okay too. So it's a long-winded way of saying, remind ourselves, yeah, I deserve a happy life. I can pursue it. And if I need help, I can ask for it. And try to remind yourself that as much as you need to.
Oh, that's wonderful advice. I don't see any more questions, comments, or considerations that have come in. And so I will say, on behalf of the Illinois Self-Advocacy Alliance and the wider community, thank you so much, Jae Jin, for sharing your experience, your expertise in this intro to developmental disabilities. I know that I learned quite a bit of new information, and for that, I thank you. For all of our participants, we thank you for taking time out of your day to spend with us. Again, this presentation is being recorded. It will be uploaded to the Alliance's YouTube channel. When we end today's presentation, a brief survey will pop up on your screen. We ask you to please consider just answering the couple of questions to let us know what you liked, what you didn't like. Your input helps us improve what we provide to you. And with that, we hope that everyone has an amazing day. Thank you all. Keep on speaking up and speaking out. Bye-bye.
Bye.